Welcome to WCEE's virtual exchange. I'm Barbara Tyran, the president of the Women's Council on Energy and the Environment, and I am very honored to host FERC Chairman Rich Glick today. Chairman Glick was named by President Biden to be the chairman on January 21st of this year after being confirmed as a commissioner by the United States Senate in 2017. Before joining the commission, Chairman Glick was the general counsel for the Democrats on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, serving as a senior policy advisor on numerous issues, including electricity and renewable energy. Prior to that, Chairman Glick was vice president of government affairs for Iberdrola's U.S. renewable energy and electric and gas utility and natural gas storage businesses. He ran the company's Washington, D.C. office and was responsible for developing and implementing the U.S. businesses' federal legislative and regulatory policy advocacy strategies. Prior to that, he was director of government affairs for PPM Energy, director of government affairs for Pacific Corp, senior policy advisor to DOE Secretary Richardson, legislative director and chief counsel to Senator Bumpers of Arkansas, and an associate in the law firm of Werner Lipford. Mr. Chairman, congratulations on your long and very illustrious career. It is now my pleasure to welcome him. As I mentioned, he will be offering some initial remarks, and then we'll go into a few questions that I will pose, but please do begin to think of questions you would like to ask the chairman and use your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This is meant to be an interactive session, and I want all of you to feel as participatory as you can in our general discussion today with FERC Chairman Glick. And please join me in virtually welcoming him for his opening remarks. Chairman Glick, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I appreciate the introduction, and it makes me feel old when you go through all the jobs that I've had. But I appreciate the very kind introduction, and I want to thank you and WCEE for inviting me to participate today. Now, I know we're going to have hopefully lots of time for Q&A, and what I personally think is much more interesting than hearing me drone on. I'm sure you all think that as well. So, but I will speak. Try to have a few points I want to make, and then we'll open up for questions. And you know, I've been at FERC for about 3.5 years, and I've been chair for like this last close to 100 days or so. But it's been amazing. I mean, first of all, it's a great job. There's so many interesting issues that we're dealing with, and they're all fascinating and really impactful. It's also been a little daunting at times because we just have so much going on, and we do have a number of key initiatives going on at FERC and right now. And I part of the agenda I had in terms of coming into the chair, there were some items I wanted to move the commission towards. Obviously, you know, you get some influence over agenda setting, and sometimes you don't necessarily get influence over the results. So we obviously are working with our colleagues on a whole bunch of issues. But I thought I would maybe outline about four of them today, just very briefly, and then turn to one other item, and then we can open up for questions if that works for everybody. With regards to, so this first item I want to talk about is market reform, and you know, we are in the process of taking a look at our RTO market design, in particular the 3 Eastern RTOs. I think many people are probably familiar that there's been a lot of controversy over the 3 RTOs in the East, which is New England ISO, New York ISO, and PJM in terms of their capacity markets. And due to a series of FERC orders, the commission has made it very difficult for states that are pursuing clean energy programs and actually any other program aimed at of trying to play a role in terms of the generation resource mix of their respective utilities. The commission has issued these MOPR approaches, which essentially have made it very difficult for these facilities that are supported by state policies to participate in RTO capacity markets. And it's had a number of impacts, one of which is that the states, in many cases, states have been very frustrated and are taking a look at whether they need to withdraw or cause their utilities to withdraw from RTO participation, or at least participation in some of these markets that the RTOs operate. And that's been very difficult. So one of the things that we're focused on is making significant revisions to the commission's previous approaches I think there's a good recognition that the Commission's approach in the past is not sustainable. And I know RTOs are looking at that. One of the other areas we're looking at in a related issue is from a market reform perspective is trying to figure out where the markets are going into the future, what's needed in the future. Obviously, we're going to have a lot more intermittent generation, wind and solar in particular. And that provides a number of benefits, but also provides some challenges as well. And one of the challenges is the need for added flexibility in the generation resource mix to address this, the intermittency. And that's one of the things we're looking at in terms of market reform is how best to promote or incent facilities that can provide that kind of flexibility. Second area that I wanted to focus on just briefly is transmission, a very high priority for us, the developing or incenting investments in additional transmission capacity. It's pretty apparent that even though I think that the distributed energy resources and energy efficiency and other demand response and other services are going to play a very big role as we transition to the clean energy future. It's also very apparent that we're not going to be able to achieve these kind of significant goals in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions unless we also have significant build out of zero emissions generation capacity. And a lot of that's going to be renewables. Now, as we know, we have great resources in the United States, great wind resources, great solar resources, both in the continental United States and offshore in many cases, especially on the wind side. But those resources are located very far from load in many cases. And so we're just going to need to build out the grid much more expansively. So we've initiated a process, or we're going to be initiating a process, and we need to work with my colleagues to assess how best to encourage or to revisit some of our current policies and regulations and assess how best we can promote a greater investment in additional transmission capacity. There's an urgent need for this. I think folks recognize we need to build out the grid sooner rather than later, and how best we do that is a question we're going to be tackling over the next coming months. The third area I just wanted to mention is extreme weather and how the impact that has on grid resilience. That's certainly becoming another hot button item. Everyone recognizes what happened in Texas back in February is just, I think, another example of the extreme weather that we see around the United States. Now, that doesn't mean we haven't had extreme weather before, but certainly in terms of extreme weather events and then the ferocity of these extreme weather events are growing. And certainly that seems to be due to climate change, and so that we don't expect that to slow down at any rate, and just the opposite. And so the question is, what does this do for grid resilience? Is the grid, are utilities and other grid operators sufficiently prepared for these extreme weather events? And obviously different regions have different weather events. Obviously tornadoes in the middle part of the country, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast and the East, and drought and fires in the West, and so on. So they all require somewhat of a different approach. But we have opened up a docket, and we actually are having a technical conference on this issue, I believe, in June, on extreme weather events. And we're going to be taking a look and talking to a number of experts about what we can do through our various regulatory authorities to promote greater resilience and so that the grid is better prepared for extreme weather events. And the last item, just wanted to briefly mention, because I suspect there are folks in WCEE that are more involved on the natural gas side than on the electric side as well. And that we have initiated, or I should say reinvigorated, a proceeding that was begun many years ago, examining how best we should move forward with our approach to siting natural gas pipeline facilities. I think people know that unlike electric transmission, which the authority resides primarily in the state, with regard to state utility commissions, FERC has a preeminent authority in siting interstate natural gas pipelines. Over time, that's gotten increasingly controversial, I think in large part because as we build more and more pipelines out, they cross more populated areas. So our whole process has come under some criticism. I've been critical of some aspects of it. In particular, in my opinion, the commission has ignored what the courts have told us in terms of whether we should adequately consider the impact of these new projects on climate change, especially the greenhouse gas emissions associated with these new pipeline projects. And up until recently, the commission has ignored that. We recently issued an order on a 3-2 vote, which we essentially reversed that call, and we're starting to take a look at the greenhouse gas emissions implications. But that's an area that I think requires additional thought. So we have a notice of inquiry proceeding on these topics, and I suspect we'll be able to act relatively, hopefully soon. I don't know about relatively soon, but hopefully soon on the this gas pipeline certificate proceeding. And so those are really the. I think I just wanted to highlight some of the key initiatives. There is one other area I wanted to talk about, and that really is, how we, from a process perspective, how we go about our business at FERC. I think there's a, growing understanding that we need to bring increased transparency and equity to our decision-making processes. And I think folks probably are aware that there's a movement towards establishing an Office of Public Participation at FERC. By way of background, back in 1978, Congress actually passed legislation establishing the office, but for a variety of reasons, it never actually was put up. It was never, the commission, no one actually got it up and running. But Congress last year essentially told us again, no, you're going to do this. You need to issue a report, I believe, by June, telling us how you're going to proceed forward in terms of establishing that office, and we're doing that right now. Where I asked Commissioner Clements to take the lead on this. She's done a great job of putting together a series of listening sessions and workshops, and hopefully we'll have some more beef to the proposal relatively soon and get that office up and running. I think it's very important. Part of the issue is, we all do this for a living. Many of us understand how the FERC processes and how to intervene in a proceeding, and how to participate, and making sure that our clients' interests are adequately represented. But there are a lot of people out there that are greatly affected by commission decisions that aren't in the same boat. And I think the commission has a responsibility through this Office of Public Participation to not only make people aware of their rights and responsibilities under the various statutes that we implement, but also provide them an opportunity to participate if they so choose. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in the near future. With regard to I think equity is a related issue. We announced recently we are we're creating a new senior level position that will be responsible for environmental justice and equity. I think it's important. It's an area that I've tried to give a lot of thought to recently in terms of how we best through our decision-making processes incorporate the views of those folks that live in so-called environmental justice communities. Those folks, for a variety of reasons, sometimes are most adversely impacted by our decisions with regard to energy projects, for instance. And we're supposed to take that into account through the NEPA process. In my opinion, we've pretty much just given lip service to that perspective for a number of years now. So hopefully that will be reinvigorated, or will reinvigorate our approach to environmental justice and equity with this new position. And along those lines, I want to say it's obviously very important to address on an outward basis the communities that are affected by our decisions, but we also need to look inward in terms of our processes and our hiring practices. We're focused on increasing the diversity of folks at the commission. I think we've done a pretty good job of that. Obviously, we still have a ways to go. With regard to WCEE, I want to point out that we have quite I think we've done very well in terms of gender diversity. We have quite a few leadership positions filled by women in our organization. Certainly my chief of staff, Pamela Quinlan, is one of them, but we have the head of the Office of Energy Market Regulation. I wrote them all down. I just want to make sure I got them all right. The head of the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation, the head of the Office of External Affairs, our chief administrative law judge, the head of our Office of Enforcement, and the head of our Office of the Office of Secretary, the SAR Secretary. So we have, I think we have a very good record there. We have a ways to go, I think, in terms of complete diversity. We're working on it, but I'm proud of where we're moving towards, and I think that's something we're going to need to focus on as well going into the future. So with that, again, Barbara, I want to really appreciate, say thank you for inviting me, and be glad to answer whatever questions anyone may have.
Thank you very much, Chairman Glick. And I see that we've added some additional participants since we began. So I want to remind everyone in the audience, first of all, welcome. And secondly, this is intended to be your dialogue with Chairman Glick. So please do feel free to put questions into the system using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be happy to moderate those questions as they come on in. So I'll begin as everyone's formulating their thoughts and questions for the chairman. Mr. Chairman, you did mention, and of course you're coming up on 100 days as chairman. Congratulations on that. But a very momentous occasion happened a few weeks after you became chairman, which is the Texas power outage. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your President's Day weekend this year was like?
Well, it's pretty good until Sunday night. But that's when I think things started to go downward. Obviously, I think if my memory serves me correctly, it was that Sunday night before President's Day in which the rolling outages started to occur in Texas. And it's something, we obviously spent a lot of time thinking about it, a lot of time talking to folks. I think people will recognize that with regard to ERCOT, we actually don't have jurisdiction over ERCOT. And so we were mostly monitoring the situation. We do have authority over grid reliability in the bulk power system, and that includes ERCOT and the rest of the United States as well. So for instance, to the extent working with NERC that we believe there are standards that are required to enhance grid reliability, our jurisdiction does extend into Texas that way. But outside of that, in terms of the day-to-day or minute-by-minute operations that were occurring, we didn't have any authority over that, but we were monitoring it quite closely. I think one of the things we did soon thereafter is we announced that NERC and FERC are jointly engaging, and they currently are engaging we are currently engaging in a joint inquiry to examine what happened and obviously make recommendations. But I think there's a couple lessons to be learned here that I think we can surmise before in advance of the inquiry. I don't want to prejudge the inquiry at all, but a couple issues. One of which is that as I said before, that we're having extreme weather events are occurring more frequently. I mean, if you look at the weather, the temperatures in Texas, I mean, no one would have ever thought it would be that cold in Texas, no less that cold for a week. And that was worse than the problem. It was obviously tragic. People lost their lives. And that's the second item. We all, I think sometimes we know how we think electricity is important. It is important. It's very important. Lights go out for a couple hours. It's a nuisance. But when they go out for a couple days or more, it's more than a nuisance, especially when it's that cold, or in the summer, if it were that hot. People literally die, and they did die in Texas. And I think we need to respect that what we're working on here when we're talking about reliability is more than just being able to charge our phones at night, which is also, I know, important to us, but we're talking about people's lives, and we need to take that seriously. Another issue that I think we'll be looking into further, but if you go back to what happened, I believe in 2011, when there was a similar, although not as long-lasting, cold snap, I believe in Texas and New Mexico, there was FERC and NERC did some sort of inquiry. There was a big report that was prepared. The report recommended that generation facilities, there was a number of recommendations, but one of them was that generation facilities be weatherized. And then somehow, when it made its way through the rulemaking, that the NERC FERC process whereby we issue mandatory reliability standards, it got watered down over time into some sort of sense of guidance, that maybe you should consider whether you want to weatherize your plant. Well, Texas, as we know, is a very competitive generation market. If your competitor isn't going to spend the money to weatherize his project, you're not going to do it for your project. And that's exactly what happened. And we saw, again, we don't want to prejudge the inquiry, but it's pretty apparent that the lack of weatherized electric generation facilities at least played a role in what happened. So from my perspective, we're doing another inquiry, but I didn't come to FERC, as I said, I've said several times, to prepare reports that we can put on the bookshelf and gather dust. If those reports recommend action, we have the authority through NERC, but also on our own, to order mandatory standards to require bulk power system providers or participants to take action, and we're going to do that if it's needed. I think we don't want a repeat of what happened in 2011.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to say that a number of questions are coming into the Q&A box, so I will turn now to some audience questions. The first one is this: Indigenous populations seem to be underrepresented, even in environmental justice forums. Could you please comment on how Indigenous perspectives and participation will be encouraged through these new areas of focus?
So I'm glad that you asked that question, because it's something that we need to have on the forefront of our minds sometimes. There are numerous tribes, Native American tribes located throughout the United States. And those tribes, in many cases, well, in all cases, I believe, are essentially sovereign entities. And we don't necessarily treat them with the respect that we treat other sovereign entities with. So for instance, if we had a discussion with Canada, we would have a bilateral, some sort of nation-to-nation conversation, but we don't do that with tribes. We should do that with tribes, but we don't often do that with tribes. And one of the things that came up in the listening sessions that we had with regard to the Office of Public Participation was just that we don't necessarily provide offer the kind of respect that various tribes deserve. So that's something we are focusing on, as we talked about. We're in the process of forming this Office of Public Participation, how it's going to operate, what it's going to do, who we're going to reach out to. But that's one area we're going to focus on with regard to tribal to government relations. But secondly, we also have an Office of External Affairs, and that office, part of that office is responsible for government to government discussions and communications. And I've already spoken to our new head of that office, Sarah Venuto, who's doing a great job. And I think many of you know her. And we've talked about making sure that we spend extra time working with the tribes, making sure that we take their interest into account and that they have sufficient opportunity for communications with us as we move forward, because a lot of our decisions do greatly affect tribal members, but also tribal lands.
Thank you very much. Another question from the audience. A recent report suggests that the grid could support a 50% increase in wind and solar via 22 high voltage power line projects. What are your thoughts regarding this report, and how can FERC play a role?
So I saw an article this morning with that summarizing that particular report. So we're trying to wade our way through it now. But I would say, without commenting specifically on that report, it coincides with the point I made a little bit earlier, which is it's very clear that we're going to need to build out the transmission grid. And there are barriers to transmission development, whether it be planning processes, whether it be cost allocation processes, whether it be siting, which is mostly at the state level and not at FERC. But we need to address this. We need to address it sooner rather than later, because if as I said before, we're going to need all those that 50% or so increase in wind and solar development. We're not going to get there if we don't build out the grid. So that's going to be a high priority for myself, and I know it's a high priority for the Biden administration. All you have to do is look at the president's infrastructure plan, and then anytime you listen to Secretary Granholm, when have you heard an energy secretary talk so much about electric transmission? It's gratifying that she's so focused on that issue, and I think there's a lot of folks at the state level as well thinking, what can we do to help promote grid development?
Good, thank you very much. The next question picks up on your point regarding extreme weather, one of the key points you made, and the question is about resilience. Does FERC plan to open a new docket examining resilience, or do you see those issues being addressed in the extreme weather docket that you already have?
Well, that is the new docket we opened up. We opened up a new docket, I believe, in February. During our February meeting, commission meeting, and so that's the docket, which whatever action will come out of the discussions that we're going to have at the upcoming technical conference, and then I'm sure comments will be submitted after that. We would take pursuant to that docket.
And the next question switches over. You mentioned natural gas pipeline siting. So this particular questioner is asking about the social cost of carbon and how that might fit into what you just described.
Right. So one of the issues that we're considering is, how best to, well, if we do examine a proposed pipeline's impact on in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of impact on climate change, some people argue, well, you can't do that because there's no way of figuring it out. We don't have some sort of metric to assess how significant those emissions are in terms of their impact on climate change. And my first argument is that doesn't make a lot of sense. We actually examined a whole bunch of other environmental impacts associated with the proposed pipeline project, and we don't always have the metrics to a set of metrics to examine significance. We kind of use what I call the eyeball test. We kind of look at it and determine whether it's significant or not. But I've argued this in numerous dissents that we've written, and that is that there are other options for, if you want metrics, and certainly the social cost of carbon is one. I know that the CEQ, I'm sure, is working on updating the administration's approach, or CEQ's approach to calculating the social cost of carbon, and we'll be following that closely. But that is one option we have on the table potentially, and we'll have to see how it comes out in the comments to this NOI process as to whether we should use the social cost of carbon when examining impacts of greenhouse gas emissions.
Good, thank you. Continuing on the topic of natural gas pipeline siting, this questioner talks about the role of hydrogen and its potential use as in a national climate strategy. Can you talk about how you see dedicated hydrogen pipelines, or perhaps the blending of hydrogen into natural gas pipelines, and what would be the authorities and regulatory process around that?
So, I had a conversation with someone recently about this, because as I understand it, with regard to blended product, where it's like maybe 20% hydrogen and the rest natural gas, which I think is generally what folks do these days, if I'm not mistaken. We do have authority over the transportation of that fuel, so to speak, through our authorities under the Natural Gas Act. But it's not entirely clear, or it's not clear to me, that we have authority over just the transportation of hydrogen in general through a pipeline. My guess is Congress would have to clarify whether they would want FERC to have that authority under the Natural Gas Act or some other authority.
Thank you. We're going to continue on that theme as well. And the next questioner wants to know about mitigation, that you've talked about mitigation in the past of adverse environmental impacts under NEPA, and whether you've given any thought to the Commission balancing that analysis under the certificate policy statement.
Yes, and I'm glad that question was asked. So, as I mentioned before, we're required to examine a whole. Well, first of all, when we grant a pipeline certificate, essentially what we're saying is the public interest of the pipeline, the benefits of the pipeline outweigh the adverse impacts. And in many cases, in most cases, I would say, when we do environmental analysis of a proposed pipeline, and if there are going to be adverse impacts, we try to mitigate them through conditions that are placed in the pipeline certificate. So, for instance, wetlands, which is a good example to use, we generally require companies to engage in various activities to restore wetlands, to essentially restore other wetlands, to balance off the adverse impact to certain wetlands areas that may occur, with the construction of a new pipeline. But we do that with a whole variety of environmental impacts, but we haven't to date done that on climate change. And my point is, people are worried that somehow, if we're going to look at the greenhouse gas emissions impact of a pipeline project, somehow that's going to automatically cause us to deny a pipeline. I say, no, that's not the case at all. First of all, you could find that the emissions aren't significant, and we did that recently in an order last month, I believe. But even if you found them significant, the emissions, that is, you could say, well, let's mitigate them. A company could plant trees. It could buy greenhouse gas emissions offsets. It can reduce the emissions from the project, and take various actions to do that. There are a lot of things the pipeline company can do to mitigate those emissions. And in that case, you can still find that the project overall, the benefits of the project outweigh the adverse impacts if you mitigate those adverse impacts. So I think it's something we're going to be taking I'm hoping, at least I would like to take a look at that going forward. And when we do have significant emissions, if we could mitigate them before we even consider whether the pipeline is in the public interest or not.
Thank you. We're continuing again, still around pipelines. And this is, what is the future for greenfield pipelines and developers? Is the pre-filing consultative process still effective when a pipeline developer has to deal with new regs such as climate impacts?
Yeah, again, I don't think things are going to change much. I think to the extent that greenfield development was permissible in the past, it's still people are still going to be pursuing that. As I said before, it's only one additional environmental impact that we're going to consider above and beyond the ones we've already been considering. And as I laid out just in the answer to the previous question, there are ways to address those emissions and the impact on climate change, short of saying you can't build the pipeline project. So I would say I don't think there's going to be much of a change.
Good, thank you. And again, I encourage everyone in the audience, thank you so much for providing all these terrific questions for the chairman. Very much appreciated. Please do feel free to continue to put them into your system using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to switch topics a little bit here and go over to FERC Order 22A, which now pertains to demand response programs and DER interconnections beyond the originally intended stakeholders of aggregated distributed energy resources. Can you talk about the impact of the new regulation, new dimension there?
Sure. So by way of background, I think I can't remember the number of the order. It was 745 or 719. I'm getting confused by my numbers now. But a number of years ago, when the Commission facilitated demand response participation in wholesale markets, it authorized the states to essentially have an opt-out. So it said, if you, state A, don't want to have that demand response provider in your state participate in the wholesale market, you could opt out of the program and not allow that demand response provider to participate. And then subsequently, we issued Order 2222 more recently, which essentially facilitated the aggregation of distributed energy resources participation in the wholesale markets. Now, sometimes distributed energy resource aggregation can include solar panels, it can include small wind farms and very small, but it also can include demand response. And a concern was raised after Order 2222 was issued. A concern was raised in the rehearing request, saying, well, this is unfair to demand response. If you're demand response in a state that has opted out, you can't participate in this aggregation to participate with regard to DER aggregation. And so we clarified in our Order 2222A by saying, if you are a demand response entity in a state that's opted out, that demand response entity aggregates with other demand response, with other DERs. So for instance, solar panels or anything like that. You actually can then participate. We clarify that opt-out no longer exists. It's only if the aggregation is exclusively demand response entities, then the opt-out would still continue to exist. We've asked for comments as to whether people think we should continue the opt-out in general, and we'll see what those comments suggest. But for now, it's just limited to demand response entities that also aggregate with other DERs.
Got it. Thank you. Very, very helpful. Can you talk a little bit about the LNG export terminal process? There has been past efforts to streamline that, and as we hopefully enter a post-pandemic world, it may well result in increasing demand for LNG.
So the regulatory responsibility for LNG exports is it's bifurcated between FERC and the Department of Energy. FERC has the role that FERC plays under the Natural Gas Act is we essentially site the actual facility, the LNG export facility when it's built, so we are supposed to examine obviously the benefit of the project, but also whether we consider the adverse impacts of the project, but only the adverse impacts associated with the operation and construction of the project. So for instance, I'll go back to greenhouse gas emissions. We would only review the greenhouse gas emissions that are directly emitted from the operation of the project and construction, not downstream when the gas is sent to Poland or wherever it is, after it's exported. The Department of Energy actually has authority over the export of LNG. So the Department of Energy, as I think everyone probably knows, if the exports to a non-free trade agreement country, a country that the U.S. doesn't have a free trade agreement with, the Department of Energy has to make an affirmative finding that export is in the public interest. In the past, the Department of Energy has actually done the environmental analysis, the greenhouse gas emissions analysis. This was during the Obama administration to determine whether the emissions associated with the burning of the gas downstream in another country is what the impact of that might be. The Trump administration, I think on their way out the door, so to speak, they reversed that policy that we're not going to look at the environmental impact anymore of downstream emissions, the emissions overseas. I suspect the Biden administration I don't have any inside information, but I suspect they might take a different view than the Trump administration on that point. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But from a FERC perspective, again, we're limited solely to looking at the operation and construction of the project and what the impacts of that operation and construction might be, and we weigh that against the benefits of the project.
Thank you. We have a listener who is going to take us back to the Texas situation and mentions the Texas blackouts demonstrated the interdependency of natural gas pipelines and electricity generation. You have raised concerns about the security implications of this interdependency in the past, advocating for greater pipeline security. Do you think federal efforts to secure pipelines from physical and cyber threats are adequate?
So first of all, I'll speak on cyber threats. The answer is no, I don't think they're adequate. The GAO submitted a report to Congress several years ago, which I think made it very clear that the TSA, I think, a lot of people still probably don't know that the TSA has responsibility for cybersecurity over all pipelines, oil and gas pipelines throughout the United States, including the distribution pipelines. So it's quite a lot of pipelines. TSA does a great job at the airports and elsewhere, the ports around the country and so on. They only have a few people. I think it was like 5 or 6 when they're in full capacity that are working on pipeline security around the country. And that, to me, that's not sufficient. And I don't think they're ever going to get there. I've advocated, and actually, Commissioner Chatterjee and I jointly wrote an article about this in the Houston Chronicle several years ago. Advocated that Congress take a look at moving that authority. It doesn't have to be to FERC, but we just think it needs to move somewhere. Secondly, I think the Texas example, and the questioner is exactly right, raised some significant additional questions about pipeline reliability. And as everyone knows, on the electric side, FERC has, jointly with NERC, we have authority over the bulk power system and reliability and ability to impose standards and so on. There's not a similar set of authorities with the natural gas pipelines. And I think at the very least, and this does not have to go to FERC if Congress deems it otherwise, but I think Congress needs to take a look at this and assess whether they need to have a similar approach to natural gas pipeline reliability as they do to electric pipeline reliability. Because as we saw in Texas, and I think we've seen in other parts of the country, if the pipelines go down or something happens to gas flowing through one pipeline, it can have a dramatic impact on our electric reliability as well.
Thank you. We have another question coming in around the topic of renewable integration into RTOs and utilities. The questioner is observing that it seems to be taking much longer than it used to make these kinds of decisions. And that although people are saying they're looking into the issues, the time is not on our side. The question is FERC looking at ways to ensure swifter integration into RTOs, or is that something that Congress should consider?
So if the swifter, I'm not sure I understand the question. Is it integration of utilities into the joining RTOs, or?
No, integration of renewables into utilities and into RTOs.
Okay. I assume the question that's relates to interconnection, and yes. that is a growing problem. So as we all know, the interconnection queues in several regions are growing exponentially, and the time we're moving forward with these in the interconnection processes are taking longer and longer. And the FERC has, on 2 different occasions, tried to tackle the subject of queue reform, and I think we made some progress. But in reality, we have just so much demand in terms of new solar and new wind in particular. If you look at these queues, in most parts of the country, more than 90% of each region's queues, in some of the RTO queues, are almost solely wind and solar. Some of them have combined hybrid projects with storage as well, but most of them are wind and solar. And if we're going to achieve all these great goals that we have in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we got to get these projects moving faster than they are. And so I think one of the things that part of my priorities is I didn't really outline it earlier, but I think on the transmission side, it's also to take a look at how can we further expedite the interconnection process. One area I think is worth taking a look at. It's a slightly related issue is cost allocation. So, for instance, if you're going to build a project and you got to pay hundreds of millions, if not more, for a network upgrade, you're unlikely to go forward with your generation plan if you have to pay for the network upgrade through the participant funding methodology. I think we need to take another look at that. It doesn't seem to make sense to require the first generation plant in line to pay the full cost when a number of people are going to benefit from that network upgrade when it's actually up and running. So I think the whole interconnection process, which I think is related to the integration of renewables in the RTOs pursuant to the question, is something we need to tackle and probably do it sooner rather than later.
Thank you. The next question is talking about the balance here with a number of different factors as it relates to transmission siting. So you've talked about the need for more transmission infrastructure, and yet oftentimes FERC has cited transmission and pipelines along existing rights of way. So as we balance that fact with the fact that we're also trying to avoid adverse environmental impacts, with the fact that we're also trying to be thoughtful around indigenous communities, how do we weigh all those issues when talking about upgrading or providing both transmission infrastructure, but also broadband internet access?
So with regard to electric transmission infrastructure, except in very rare circumstances, FERC doesn't have authority over the siting. That occurs at the state level. But I think where the question is headed is exactly right. You know, there are it's difficult to site big infrastructure projects. That's why sometimes they take a long time to move forward. And in large part because, you know, I understand that if someone was digging up your land and wanted to, you know, put a big transmission line over your house, you wouldn't want to do that either, right? So you wouldn't want that to happen to you either. So I think the use of existing rights of ways, it's an exciting approach. There are railroad rights of ways. There are, as you mentioned, there are gas pipeline rights of ways. There are broadband rights of ways. And I think to the extent you can coordinate, I know this is something the Transportation Department in particular is taking a look at. I understand Secretary Buttigieg has taken a personal interest, as I've been told, in that particular issue. And there are projects that are currently on the board being planned that would use existing rights of ways. And I think that's something we need to encourage as a country to help facilitate a speedier siting process.
Good, thank you. So the next questioner is asking about the expansion of RTOs and potentially obligating transmission owners to submit their infrastructure to an RTO or an ISO. Any thoughts around that?
So first of all, I'm a big believer in RTOs. I think they provide tremendous benefits, both in terms of savings for consumers. They also enhance grid reliability. They integrate, you're talking about integration of renewable resources. They integrate renewable resources much more efficiently and cost effectively than outside the RTO process. And they also help provide, balancing, or, for instance, if you have some wind in the western part of your RTO and wind in the eastern part of your RTO, it's windy in one area and not in the other. That certainly, there's some benefits to integrating and dispatching all your generation together. Having said that, I think there are some legal limitations on what FERC can do in terms of forcing utilities to join an RTO. We certainly try to encourage them. We have various benefits, including a much more streamlined approach to market-based rate authority if you participate in an RTO. But I think Congress in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, made it difficult for FERC to order utilities to participate. But I know that the two regions of the country in the West and the Southeast are two areas that are the ones without the RTOs, except for California. And I think there would be significant benefits to both regions if they did move forward with an RTO, and we'll continue to encourage that. But I think we will need to, for legal reasons and other reasons, stop short of ordering them to participate.
Thank you. I'm going to switch topics now over to a recent FERC order that determined that QF status should be based on the power production capacity of the facility as a whole, not the capacity of an individual component part. Do you anticipate these issues will be revisited at FERC, or potentially PURPA reform will be visited in Congress?
Well, so two answers to that. First of all, last year, the commission finalized a rulemaking under PURPA. They made a number of changes, many of which I was opposed to. And in large part, I thought the commission was essentially trying to rewrite the statute out of frustration, because a lot of folks that have been pushing for PURPA reform for a number of years weren't able to get sufficient majorities in Congress to enact PURPA reform legislation. And so I think, and I said this publicly, in my opinion, it was a lot of the reforms that we implemented where I think were contrary to the law. We're essentially trying to rewrite the law. So I don't think we're allowed to do that. But again, it's been done in part. With regard to the issue that I think the question was based on, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it's based on a recent order that the commission issued, revisiting a previous order that the commission has issued under a different chair, in which there was a question as to how you define the energy output of a facility or the energy capability of a facility, because these small power producers are limited to 80 megawatts. And so we addressed that. I'm trying to jog my memory, but I believe that that issue is still pending on rehearing, so I'm not allowed. I can't talk about the specifics of that particular case.
Of course, thank you. I'm sure we all understand. I am going to repeat one of the questions that we already discussed. The member in the audience, who was actually a former WCEE president, requested that I read it verbatim so we can make sure that it's I'm specifically phrasing it the way she would like. So here we go. FERC has often encouraged pipeline sponsors to follow existing rights of way as a way to lessen adverse environmental impact. The Biden administration's recently articulated strategies encourage the same practice for transmission lines. Do you see a tension between these practices and the increased focus on minimizing adverse impact on environmental justice communities? What comes to mind as ways to balance what appears to be two competing issues? Would improving other aspects of infrastructure, such as upgrading or providing broadband internet access, potentially have value in this conversation?
I appreciate that, and I think I understand the question. And first of all, it's a great question. That's a very important point, because if we're going to encourage the development of transmission lines along the same routes where we have pipelines and other infrastructure projects, and as I mentioned earlier, there's probably an inordinate burden that's been placed on environmental justice communities with building previous infrastructure projects. You're just making it worse in some sense, and so we do need to balance the two. How we're going to do that? Again, on the electric transmission side, we don't have that current authority. That's mostly at the state level. There are some federal reviews as well, but and not really at the FERC level. But so it's easy for me to pun on the question. But I want to say to the questioner that you asked a perfectly good question, and it's something that everyone in various government levels needs to think about, because it's not that simple as saying, yeah, we should build where we previously built if we've already built through some disadvantaged communities that we're just going to make it worse on them. So I don't know the answer about how to proceed, but that we need to balance the two.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to remind the audience that we have a few minutes left. The chairman has been very generous with this time, but if anyone has any burning questions to ask, now would be the time to put them into the Q&A box. Please remember just to use the button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get those in before we wrap up our session today. I'm going to return to the chairman's illustrious background, and as we all know, you've had experience in a number of different areas, Senate committee staff, DOE, federal government relations, law practice. As you're thinking about the processes involved in running the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and particularly the opening of the new Office of Public Participation, how have those past experiences governed your decisions?
Well, I think in part my experiences on Capitol Hill probably the most have provided me the most thought about in terms of going forward in terms of how I worked at FERC over the last several years. In the sense, I was a staff person at the on Capitol Hill, both in the Senate for Senator Bumpers, and then more recently at the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And I think it's being a former staff person, I think it's very important to rely very heavily on staff, and I have an amazing group of advisors, some of the smartest people you ever want to meet on a whole variety of issues. And I think it's important to not give complete deference, that there are times we do disagree, but for the most part, rely on them heavily in terms of their thought processes, their recommendations, and suggestions for how we should proceed. And I try to give them as much leeway as possible, because I think that is the best model that worked very well on Capitol Hill, both of my stints there. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and also deferring to their expertise. I'm not going to be, there's a gazillion orders we have to go through, and sometimes there are nuances that I don't always pick up, and they do. And so I think it's like I said, that's why I learned on Capitol Hill. You just need to rely heavily on good staff, and I have an amazing group of advisors to do that. And not only the advisors, but also the rest of the commission staff that we now get to work with very closely. They're the most professional group of government employees, I think, that probably exists in any agency.
Good, thank you. You mentioned at the beginning that you have a number of women leaders at FERC, and of course, WCEE supports women leaders in energy and the environment. So thank you for that. Can I ask you, what is your proudest accomplishment since arriving at FERC in 2017?
You know, just kind of along the lines of the same answer. It may not be, I could point to different orders and so on. But I think again, going back to my team of advisors, we've had several of my, actually all of my advisors have had, not all, most of them have had children over the last several years. So sometimes they've been out on maternity or paternity leave. But so we've had people that have been detailed and so on. But the fact is that the 4 advisors that I started out with are still on our team. That really is my proudest achievement, that I haven't scared them off. And like I said before, they just do an amazing job, and it's a pleasure for me to work with them every day. And so I'm really proud of the fact that they've all stayed the entire time that they've been at the commission.
Good, thank you. And then the converse of that question, which is what has been your greatest challenge since you arrived at the commission?
So I would say, to put it another word, I'd say my greatest level of frustration maybe has been, this was the first couple of years at the commission. Well, we've had a lot of turnover, and you know, going back to when I started almost about a week before, but Kevin McIntyre was the chair, and I think everyone knows, you know, he had a reoccurrence of cancer and tragically passed away. So there's been there was so much turnover at FERC, and there has been over the last several years a lot of comings and goings. And sometimes it's difficult for the commission to get into a rhythm on that. But Kevin McIntyre was a great leader, and I really enjoyed working with him. And then we had Chairman Chatterjee, and then Chairman Danley, and so on, and back and forth and so on. But frustration I felt initially was that with all the turnover and all that, it somewhat became, for a variety of reasons, it became somewhat of a partisan situation in which, you know, we were told the other side, the majority had the votes. I could take it or leave it. There wasn't the kind of negotiation, and I was very frustrated with that. But that turned around towards the second half of Chairman Chatterjee's tenure, and then through Chairman Danley's tenure as well. And I think we had a much better relationship, and I'm hoping that we've carried that forward now. That doesn't mean we're going to agree on every issue, because we don't. But I think we have a much better give and take, a much better effort to compromise. And so it's been a level of frustration. I would say one other area that I want to point out, level of frustration, is on the MOPRs. I'm frustrated that I wasn't able to do more to stave off what I think the commission has done to the three eastern RTO markets. I think we've really devastated those markets through our various orders, and it's a mess that we're just starting to clean up right now. It's going to take a while to clean it all up.
Thank you. I think you may have one more question, so I'll go into that. Here we are. Okay, reading it from our audience. Carbon dioxide pipelines are a key aspect of carbon capture and sequestration strategies to combat climate change. Several years ago, a prior commissioner testified that FERC had no authority nor interest in regulating interstate CO2 pipelines. Is that still FERC's position?
Well, I tend to think that's probably true on the legal side, that we don't have the statutory authority if Congress gave us that authority. But I would not say that we have no interest in that. I think our interest would lie if Congress gave us the authority or not. I could see a rationale for providing us with that authority, but they haven't done so yet. So again, I don't think we have the legal authority to do so. Just like the hydrogen situation I mentioned a while ago. But I'm certainly willing to, if Congress were to give us that authority, we'd move forward and do as they say.
Good, thank you. We have just a few minutes left. Are there any final remarks you'd like to offer, Mr. Chairman? Anything that we haven't touched on here that you think is an important topic?
Well, I would just say, I think people, as we've outlined, we're handling a lot of issues now. We're probably, maybe we've bitten off a lot. Hopefully we can chew it all, so to speak. But there's a lot of change going on in the industry right now, and we're trying to do as best we can in terms of moving forward with the policies, hopefully that the majority of the commissioners, or if not the entire commission, can reach consensus on. But that also means it affects a lot of the folks in WCEE in terms of your clients and various companies and other groups that you all work for. So I would strongly suggest that, I know we're still in a virtual mode, and at least at FERC, where people haven't gone back to the building yet for the most part. But please, if you please come in and meet with myself, meet with my colleagues, certainly meet with commission staff as well. It's important for us to have the benefit of your thoughts, not only through meetings, but also participating in the various proceedings, whether it be technical conferences or through comments submitted or whatever else. It's very important that we have your thoughts as we move forward.
Well, thank you so much for extending that warm welcome to us to stay connected with you and your fellow commissioners and staff there. Thank you for your time here today, your thoughtful remarks and the answers to so many different questions. We appreciate your leadership and your public service. And thank you, Chairman Glick, and thank you to everyone in the audience and those who asked questions. Very much appreciate your involvement and engagement in today's discussion. Please join me in virtually thanking FERC Chairman Rich Glick. Thank you, Chairman Glick.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.